firstly, a word of thanks to the organizers for risking a emeritus on the podium. We so seldom get the opportunity that we sometimes misuse it. Also, apology. As a very amateur winemaker, I'm in the final phase of primary fermentation. So therefore, I was five minutes late. Do not look at my nails. Then a recollection, and that somehow feeds into being or attempting to be honest about your own context. I started lecturing at this faculty in April 1991. My first class was on Jonah. And there were two of the more intelligent students at the back of the class. And when I said, and after a historical critical analysis, of course, one of them got this evil smile and said, "This is not quite the interpretation we are used to in non-biblical subjects." I said, "Well, that's your problem, not mine. But since then, it has also become my own problem." In a sense, context change, and somehow we have to keep track of the input made also by different, often marginalized interpretive communities. The outline is introduction, and you will see that the paper hopefully developed from what I intended to do when I submitted the abstract, which is not always a good sign. But okay. So I will look at the existing interpretations. It will to some extent overlap with what has already been done, but with more emphasis on the so-called satirical readings. Then I will bring in some reference to historical and geographical context, also due to certain erroneous presuppositions among certain members of other interpretive communities. And then to somehow also indicate how my own view changed. I will look at the gender of the fish and how it changed from masculine to feminine, but very brief. Right, let's look at the introduction. How do we reflect on the book? Okay, let's first look at Marx. During this 1991 lecture, I said, please look at the rendition of Marx. The big fish is the size of a sardine. The more important visual impression is that of a bearded prophet. Present company excluded. That also reminded me of the surrealist joke made by Salvador Dali, when the little sardine asked his or her mother, "What is this thing when a submarine passes?" Now you must remember most sardines end up in a tin. So the mother responded to the sardine, pointing to the submarine, "There goes our revenge on humankind." So somehow the sardine also resonated with me. So how do we reflect on the book of Jonah and not get bogged down in superficial queries about the size of the fish, etc., etc.? Does it make any sense to use queer theory and hermeneutics to engage with the book of Jonah? So this contribution will be informed by this drawing of Jonah by Mark Chagall that reduces the fish to the size of a sardine, dominated by the prophet. This contribution will attempt to interpret the book as possibly a satirical narrative that is critical about the prophetic office and the identity of Allah. Amidst a wide range of definitions, attempting to articulate important aspects of queer theory, the following four aspects will be taken as point of departure. Now, I must in all honesty confess not to be an expert, and this might be considered to be a selective and even somewhat dated version. It seems to me that Michael Warner's observation that queer gets a critical edge by defining itself against the normal rather than just the heterosexual. So it doesn't disqualify an inquiry about heterosexual. David Halpern's insistence is important that queer is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal that legitimate the dominant. And somehow this third feeds into, on the one hand, Michel Foucault's understanding of power as an operation that creates interiority and thereby justifies a normalizing body of evaluative institutional practices. And this can manifest itself in alarming different ways. And also Judith Butler's argument that the self is not the cause, rather the effect, and that the deed precedes the doer, that gender, sexuality, probably almost all aspects of identity are performative. So next time around, I will rather attempt a performative interpretation of Jonah, although Janet Matthews has already done excellent work in this regard. Existing interpretations. Extensive research on the reception of Jonah in Western culture by Yvonne Sherwood has not only described but challenged several interpretive trends throughout the ages. And here I apologize also for overlapping a little. The initial development from New Testament and Church Fathers who focused on the optimistic parallelism between Jonah and Jesus, which followed a positive attitude to Jonah as a prophet. Just the next slide. So this is a window in a church in Haarlem, where the prophet just being regurgitated by the big fish, then of course points to Matthew and say, more than Jonah is here. So it's almost as if he went through all the trials and tribulations just to become a sign, and according to the New Testament, that more than Jonah is then available. Back, please. Reformation exegetes like Luther, and I'm so much a Luther than a Calvinist that I was again ashamed at my own orientation in terms of reformers who consider Jonah to be a representative of Jews and who use him as a vehicle to denounce Judaism. Echoes of blatant anti-Semitism. Then eventually the Enlightenment gave rise to many rational explanations of the fantastic components of the Jonah narrative, that God could, of course, as created fish big enough to swallow and regurgitate Jonah. The latter half of the 20th century experienced a change from historical critical research to more literary and rhetorical approaches to textual interpretation, and eventually attention was given to the deconstructive elements that undermines the goals it set out to achieve. So if we then could turn to the further interpretation, more focused on the satirical meanings. If satire entails a form of literature that criticizes a vice or folly by holding it up as ridicule, sarcasm, irony, and overstatement, this is a Jonah seems like a good example to illustrate this drama. But there are diverging views on how to understand satire. On the one hand, the influential André Jonah indicated how a work of art would start up as satire and then end up as irony, as well as juxtaposing satire, as he very succinctly indicated, as distraction, and irony more as education. On the other hand, on the other side of the Atlantic, from Northrop Frye allowed for a closer look between satire and irony when he described the former, satire, as militant. It was aggressive irony, and identified two essential elements: humor founded on fantasy, or a sense of the absurd and the grotesque, as well as, on the other hand, a clear object of attack or critique. As early as 1794, the highly gifted but controversial Thomas Paine argued that Jonah was written to satirize a prophet. Now, just Thomas Paine, he developed a smokeless candle, designed egregious, and also accused the first president of the United States, Washington, as being a fake. I mean, and at his funeral, there were only 16. So you can understand that he did not ingratiate himself so much. And he wrote this reflection on Jonah whilst he was imprisoned by the French in the Luxembourg jail in Paris. Perhaps that was the belly of the fish for him. Much later, in good, his influential irony in the Old Testament refers to the book of Jonah as a satire while using examples to illustrate the so-called absurdity of God, also illustrating how the concepts of irony and satire converge and overlap. In the influential Jonah commentary by Hans von Wolff, he refers to satire at least 10 times, but never defines what is meant with the concept, other than agreeing with Jonah, and indicating that there is a movement from satire to irony in the 4 chapters that comprise the book of Jonah. Claims made by Wolff that the name Jonah, meaning dove, was a satirical choice, is due to the depiction of the dove in Hosea 7:11 as easily deceived and senseless. But this argument, I think, is not convincing, because this is the only clearly negative comment on dove's behavior of the 50 non-sacrificial uses of the term in the Masoretic text. I'm also bird watcher, so perhaps I'm slightly prejudiced against negative figurization through that. In an important and wide-ranging article, John Holbert argues that Jonah is a short story characterized by the use of satire, and concludes that Jonah is the target of satiric attack, later on clarifying it as an attack on Hebrew prophetic hypocrisy, without specifying which group the author had in mind. James Ward acknowledged that the most common scholarly views of Jonah are that it was meant to counter an exclusive doctrine of election and to counter a rigid doctrine of retribution. So at least for our systematic colleagues, there are also some joy, even perhaps in Jonah. But when the book is taken as satire, then its primary purpose is to hold up a mirror to theological smugness and puncture self-inflated piety. That's perhaps a message to our practical theologians. The focus on Jonah as a prophetic critique is followed up by David Marcus, who examines Jonah as one of 4 narratives in the Hebrew Bible Old Testament that appear to be critical of prophets and who make use of satire in the negative depiction of a prophet. Marcus characterizes satire as a text that has a target that is being criticized and that maintains a dominating mixture of unbelievable elements, ironies, ridicule, parody and rhetorical features. It is above contention that Marcus did succeed in pointing out satiric elements in the book, but it's another matter whether he succeeded in his depiction of the book as an anti-prophetic or as primarily an anti-prophetic satire. One must also take into account the persuasive argument by Yvonne Sherwood that certain mainline Jonah interpreters have opted for a satirical reading, did so most probably due to their Protestant bias related to the presumption of divine mercy, vested interest with regards to the maintenance of the status quo, and prejudice, amongst others, against the Jewish other. In contrast to the mainline Protestant interpreters, interpretive communities struggling for survival or mere recognition on the margins of society and power have tended to relish the ambiguity, the slipperiness of Jonah, and pose questions that raise profound issues related to their own precarious existence in society as a whole and in faith communities in particular. Sherwood describes how Jewish interpreters, and I was impressed by the range. On the one hand, Rabbi Ishmael, way back during the Middle Ages, Rashi, Abba Fanel, etc., as examples of interpretation from the margins of society that have been critical about the role God plays in the book of Jonah by posing critical and probing questions. And this resonates with several of the previous papers. Is God siding with the enemies? Is God a good God? Why should mercy be expressed so cruelly? And numerous interpretations also refrain from lampooning Jonah by comparing the agony suffered by Jonah and Job, by Jonah with Job, and also with lamentation. I also refer to Johannes Lindblom, also pointed out that prophets often experience some sort of unease with the uncertainty, the unpredictability of Jonah's action. So not only in Jonah, but also in Zephaniah, Joel, and several others. In a recent commentary of Jonah, Amy Erickson points out that the Jewish interpreters tend to be more appreciative of Jonah's position and more critical about the role that is ascribed to God. This results in humor that is self-reflective, self-critical, but also targets the powerful. And she considers this to be not 8th century, but typical of diaspora humor, so post-5th century onwards, which often has a cathartic function. In agreement with Sherwood, Erickson prefers to describe the book of Jonah as a parody and not as a satire, because satire seeks to mock a potentially deviant point of view in order to encourage readers to reject it. Parody highlights the play and the tension between perspective, exposing and reveling in the weaknesses and the insight that is contained in each one. She also contrasts depictions of Jonah emerging in the book, on the one hand, as the defiant, utterly oppositional anti-prophet who rejects God's commission without a moment's hesitation, according to the text in chapter 1, to the psalm-singing Israelite whose faith is so constant and indestructible. He becomes the parody of martyrdom and self-sacrifice in chapter 2. But in the last 2 chapters, it becomes increasingly clear that he is untransformed, unenlightened, persistently foolish, instead of becoming increasingly wise. In the description of Adonai's role and the presence in Jonah's narrative, contrasting features come to the fore. On the one hand, the character of God, sovereign over all creatures, nations, and realms of the cosmos. But on the other hand, we cannot get Jonah, his prophet, to bend his bow. I then very briefly look at the historical and geographical context, and there I try to argue that the ask is Jonah in the book of is the Jonah in 1 verse 1 the same as the prophet Jonah, son of Amittai, mentioned in 2:14. If so, the historical context of Jonah falls within the heyday of the hated Assyrian Empire during the reign of Jeroboam II. If not, we must scrutinize some circumstantial evidence to suggest an appropriate historical context within which satirical reading would make sense. It is crucial to distinguish between narrated time, reign of Jeroboam, circa 760, and the time of narration, most probably during the post-exilic and Second Temple period. So there's no doubt that the narrator situates the narrative in a time when Nineveh was the epitome of aggression and the heart of an oppressive empire. This does not imply that the time during which the Jonah narrative was written coincides with the time presupposed in the text. Take note that the sequence in the Masoretic text of the so-called minor prophets differs from the sequence in the LXX, in the Septuagint. In the Septuagint, Jonah is placed next to name. And in name, it's clearly described how Nineveh was conquered and obliterated in a very bloody way. So there is definitely a change in perception as to how Jonah was also interpreted if you look at the canonical sequence. I look at Tarshish, Joppa, and Nineveh, and I will not bore you with that. Next. One can also look at inter-biblical comparisons. And they're very briefly. In tentative agreement with Peter Weimar, one can consider the possibility that Jonah 3 might have been contrasting Jeremiah 36. And then come to the logical conclusion that the contrasted use in Jonah as a parody makes much more sense if it was derived from Jeremiah and not the other way around. So it is the direction of influence which is important. Conrad Schmidt argues that the title God of Heaven, found only in Jonah 1:9, is also found in texts that probably belong to the Persian period, Ezra, Nehemiah, 2 Chronicles, and the slippery Genesis 24. And this might be an indicator that it was shaped in the Persian period, etc. If the book of Jonah was finalized in the post-exilic period, long after the destruction of Israel, it begs the question why Adonai was merciful towards a city that would eventually take the 10 tribes of all the kingdom into oblivion. Now, in just a few minutes, let's reflect on the agenda of the big fish. This is the minor cut of Azariah and Bata from the Augsburg Center. Brief consideration of the agenda of the big fish as part of my very amateurish inquiring of Jonah 1:17 to 1 in the Masoretic text. So 1:17, but the Lord provided a large fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. To 1, then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, which now becomes feminine. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried. So in 1:17 to 1 in the Trinity, the noun for fish is dag, masculine. So you at the back, you paid a lot of money for your Hebrews. It's masculine, while in 2:1, 2:2 Masoretic text, it's dagar, feminine. There's no other example in the Hebrew Bible where the noun appears in the masculine form and then as a feminine in the single textual unit, much less in the span of 2 verses. Explaining this change in gender as a mere scribal error is not convincing, because earliest Hebrew and even in the Targumim manuscripts, they contain exactly the same two forms. Erickson, I think, provides a quite compelling explanation that the gender shift is a poetic or literary device deployed to create a parallel between Jonah's experiences in the ship and in the fish's belly, as well as to enhance and anticipate the womb tomb imagery in the poem. She substantiates this is Erickson, by referring to the fact that the Hebrew beten does not refer exclusively to womb. It is a common designator of the uterus. And similar depictions of the underworld with womb-like qualities, which you find in Psalm 139, Job 1, etc. She contends then that beten appears in parallel with a feminine form dagar that strengthens the image of the belly as a particularly feminine organ, womb, and that this play between belly and womb of Sheol resonates with the ideas of death as a return to the mother's womb, which you find in Ecclesiastes 5. And this might be, if you look at Jesus' Bethsaida 40, it might be a concept rooted in the idea, which we also use even today, of mother earth. So before you despair, let's turn to the conclusion. If postmodernity can be characterized as protesting against the binary oppositions that usually require a choice of one or the other, often in service of power, this protest opens up the possibility of moving from all to act. Queer theory opens up new horizons of pertinence by establishing an interpretive frame that critiques existing conceptions of prophecy, priesthood, salvation, the exclusivity of Israel, most probably in the post-exilic period. The conclusion of the book describes how Adonai's renunciation of Nineveh's punishment enrages Jonah, without indicating the reasons for his anger, simply because it was Nineveh or because the strict command of justice has not been met. Justice as retributive justice. Whatever the conclusion implies, this abrupt ending with an unanswered question, reminds me of Job, is significant, and queer theory allows us to bring closure, not to bring closure to the, at least you are awake, allows us not to bring closure to this intriguing text and persist in our ongoing attempts to suggest answers to probing rhetorical questions. Although the historical critical interpretation has generally given way to a synchronic literary and rhetorical system that emphasized the role of, amongst others, narrative technique and literary hyperbole in the account of Jonah's resistance to his prophetic commission, it was post-Shua Jewish theological study that demonstrated that the book is designed to address the problem of theodicy, insofar as Adonai accepts the repentance of Nineveh, which will one day destroy Jonah's homeland. During the past few decades, scholarly attention has moved from countless attempts to reconstruct the original words and persons of the prophet, to paying attention to the ongoing process of reception, which was excellently done by the previous papers. And this contribution would like to specify the contribution queer theory can make in reading and making sense of this ambiguous book. Queer theory is not only about the critique of normative heterosexuality, but against power legitimizing normalcy. That queer theory provides us with a reading strategy which opens up prophecy, the presumptive nature of self-righteous retribution, and an understanding of God that does do justice to the unpredictability of divine action. And then after listening to the previous two papers, queer theory enables us to keep the process of Jonah interpretation open, also triggered by the epistemology of vulnerability, not only to criticize, but to be criticized. So the Inqueering of Jonah opens up new interpretive horizons. And this reflects on colleague Alvea's paper yesterday, that reflects on the implications that the fish ye in chapter 1 becomes the fish she in chapter 2. That I still have to bring my mind around. More seriously, that it addresses the hurts and suffering of marginalized communities that are ignored, neglected, suppressed by mainstream biblical studies and theological reflection. I mean, the ethics of interpretation is crucial, thereby refraining from just on reverberating orthodox variations on a theme that most often legitimate existing power.